Comedy has changed a lot recently, and while a lot of that is the effect of private equity controlling entertainment from the top down, there are also forces affecting comedy from the bottom up. Those forces, among others, are the reason that you now see the world's highest paid comedians saying stuff like this.
And I was like, yeah, but I feel like if she could cook, she wouldn't have that black eye.
When did comedy go from being about getting laughs to about getting laughs at women or trans people? When did we revert to the way we did things in the 80s, using gay and retarded as pejoratives? 2020, that's when. Like every other facet of life, comedy was forced to change during COVID. A few short years down the road, we all just accept that we're gonna get COVID from time to time. And we're also apparently just gonna accept that the rightward political push in comedy is endemic as well. Now, of course, there have always been conservatives. I mean, it's not like I relish change. Who does? There's always been a market for entertainment that appeals to conservative people, but this isn't Foxworthy and co. just getting her done together, handing people their signs. These are the top comedians in the world actively platforming sex traffickers or becoming anti-trans activists.
And then they say they want to be respected for their ideas, and they get their tits out because nobody gives a shit unless they're naked.
Is it fair to call this stuff right-wing? You can see a way that someone would object here, saying that advocating for the abuse of women or otherizing transgender people are not inherently political things. Both are just types of abuse, and abuse is a problem across the political spectrum. That is true. But the concepts of controlling women by force, if necessary, and defining what sex is and who can have it are definitely right-wing ideas. You can see that in their dogged commitment to abortion control, even in cases of rape, incest, or other potential harm. The right also favors unrestricted capitalism. In a way, for them, making money is proof that you were right to make it, regardless of what you did along the way. And this is how right-leaning or right-curious comedy fans treat their favorite comedians too. This person is famous, so clearly they are right to advocate for domestic abuse because it got them more famous. While comedians can control what they say, they do not control how it is received. That understanding is at the core of the artist's sort of contract with their audience. Domestic abuse, for example, is always wrong. Advocating for it is wrong. And joking about it is wrong because for some segment of your audience who are not controlled by you, your jokes will be perceived as advocacy. Thanks to social media, though, in large part, it is possible to gain influence and money by saying things that are objectionable but engaging. For more right-leaning people, that influence and money prove that the past actions were good. For more left-leaning people, it's always wrong to advocate for abuse because all people should have equal access to rights and protections from harm. That can't be a right-wing view because offering people rights and protections costs money, and that money would need to come out of the pockets of the billionaire ruling class. I think social media is one of the main drivers pushing what I call cruelty profiteering, but it's not the only factor. Let's talk a little bit more about how different things are now than just a few years ago. I want to give some perspective on what it was like to be in comedy circles when COVID happened, how comedy communities reacted, and what producing shows post-COVID looks like. If you just started paying attention to comedy in the last 3 or 4 years, you might think that it's always been the way it is now, but it hasn't. We're also going to talk about the effect of social media and podcasts on comedy. In short, I want to talk about how we got here. In early March 2020, I was producing comedy shows from sketch to improv to plays, as well as doing stand-up comedy from time to time. We just opened a new play. I was backstage with my actors waiting for the show to start, and I heard one of them talking about how there was a new disease that a lot of people were getting. By the next week, the WHO had declared COVID-19 a pandemic, the NBA had suspended basketball, and Tom Hanks announced that he and his wife both had COVID. Now, of course, the NBA will live on, but without Tom Hanks, there can be no historical film or TV. I felt torn because I was enjoying myself. I was making stuff I wanted to make with nobody sticking their nose into it and getting paid to do it. The people who ran the theater even told me that out of all the directors making work at their place, I was the cast's favorite. And that made me feel very, very proud. But I would later come to find out that I should not have felt so proud. This is foreshadowing. I was incentivized to keep doing shows and hope COVID would go away. I didn't want to put my cast in the position of having to choose between being in my show and their own feeling of safety, so I canceled it. The theater went on producing other shows for a few weeks, but eventually closed completely. So did all the other theaters in town. And then the entire comedy community exploded. Let me explain why. When I put on that first play, I interviewed each member of the cast. Simple questions, stuff like, what got you into acting? I was thinking that they, like me, had just always been theater kids, they loved the stage. No, almost all of them said they got into acting because they wanted something to do where they could make friends. Now, most of the viewers of this channel are 25 to 44, so you probably know that feeling too. My actors wanted that third space. Not home, not work, but a third place to be part of a community, maybe make some friends, maybe meet someone special. When the COVID shutdowns arrived, comedy theaters ceased to be that third space for a lot of people. And because that community was gone, a lot of people who had been putting up with abuse in comedy theaters spoke out because there was no longer a danger that talking about the abuse would destroy that third space. It was already gone. This is when I found out that the only reason I was the actor's favorite director was because I wasn't screaming at them or trying to sleep with them. It had nothing to do with my writing or directing ability at all. It's so easy to stay in an abusive relationship while it's going on. Thanks to COVID, a lot of people realized how fucked up some of the stuff they'd been dealing with really was. A lot of people at this point decided not to be involved with comedy or theaters going forward at all. But then there were other people who decided it wasn't affecting them or they didn't care about other people being abused, so they stayed in those comedy circles through the pandemic. This was the first way I think COVID acted as a sorting mechanism in comedy. Those who were okay with abuse stayed in, and those who were not left. Running a comedy theater has never been a path to wealth. Okay, maybe during the comedy boom of the 90s, sure, but most places where people do comedy have always operated on an extremely meager budget. Now, I'm not sure how this works other places than the US. Maybe in Canada or Australia, it's easier to get funding for places like theaters, but here, really the only reason you'll see a small performing space is because the person who owns the place is damned and determined to have that space, and they have the resources to keep it alive. That was before COVID, of course. Now they're mostly just gone. But at the start of COVID, those places faced an existential threat. They did everything they could to make people feel safe about coming out. They spaced the tables far apart. They smeared hand sanitizer on every surface. But there was no hiding the fact that the things that make a room great for comedy, a low ceiling, enclosed space, is exactly what's also good for transmitting respiratory viruses. And it was even harder to hide that when all those places, in addition to all the Lysol and hand sanitizer, also put a giant sign by the door that said, in effect, by entering this establishment, you agree that if you get COVID here and die, you can't sue us, even though we did nothing to protect you from COVID. Now, people often scream about how their freedoms were so unfreedomed during the US so-called lockdown, but in the places where any restrictions actually happened, it was deliberately loosely defined. It was pretty much just up to each business how to handle it. This is because right-wing focus is on protecting businesses and business owners and assumes that businesses will take care of its customers and employees somehow. COVID was a great example of how that philosophy works out on the ground. Some businesses do the right thing. Some go hard into the wrong thing. Most just shrug and do nothing. Now, if you were a business owner, you could legally determine that your business was going to only admit vaccinated people, but that guaranteed that your staff was gonna have to deal with unmasked boomer MAGA ding-dongs screaming and crying about their freedoms. I've seen grown men throw hissy fits that would be right at home at any preschool nap time. And you can see why any staff dealing with that at that point would say, you know what, to hell with this job. No amount of thanking me on Instagram as a frontline worker is worth dealing with this. That puts pressure on business owners because they need some kind of staff to stay in business. So the easiest thing to do is the same thing red state lawmakers did. Talk about regulations, talk about remedies, but don't really make any hard rules. Had there been more real leadership on the issue, businesses might have more easily been able to say to MAGA ding-dongs, listen, this is a law. I don't make the laws. But because Republican leadership, by and large, did everything they could to make regulations loose and case by case, comedy theaters were faced with a choice. Either have a safe space for crybaby MAGAs or go out of business. They chose the former. This was the second big sorting, when the only people coming out to comedy clubs leaned right and the clubs moved right to meet them. This second sorting happened at the pro level too. You can hear Tom Segura describe it in his tour documentary for his tour, I'm Coming Everywhere. It's right here on YouTube.
The pandemic started, and I started to get kind of, we were all worried. Touring came to a complete halt. What ended up happening was I would get phone calls from my agent about offers, and I just jumped on basically everything.
The reason he was able to accept all those offers and make his tour go so many places at that time is he didn't care about COVID. The venues wanted him because he is a draw. He wanted to be there to make money. Nobody in this chain cared about how many people they spread COVID to. The first leg of the tour was announced in July of 2021. Now, to be fair to Segura, the panic over COVID was slackening at that point. But the shows had to be booked months in advance. When he said yes to those dates, COVID was still an iffy prospect, and the Omicron wave was still yet to come. Lots of other comedians could have done the same thing Segura did at the same time, but many of them self-selected out of contention, presumably because they worried about getting COVID themselves or spreading it to other people by way of their crowds, or both. This strategy worked out enormously well financially for Segura. He was already having a great career, but by ignoring the risks of COVID, he made a huge leap. You can see how that would make him say, okay, well, it looks like my future and my audience are heading right, so I'm going to head right as well. Next thing you know, by December 2021, Segura's inviting Andrew Tate on his podcast. Tate is a social media influencer, popular with teen boys. He's charged with sex trafficking and rape. If you want to get in front of shitheads, he is the best bet in the podcast space, so Segura snapped him up. All of this continues to push comedy farther right. This is the thing about comedy. It simultaneously selects its audience and also trains them. There's a feedback loop there. You can hear the result of that feedback in the specials coming out on Netflix. In Segura's special, he jokes about his wife falling down the stairs. In Rife's special, he jokes about domestic abuse being okay if women can't cook. Chappelle's anti-trans crusade comes with a side order of taking shots at the differently abled. What will we see next? I don't want to know. But I also think that this feedback loop will continue to get worse. Corporations know that everyone hates ads. But the great thing about the loose format of podcasts, from the corporation's perspective, is that ads are often read by the podcast's host, a person the audience presumably likes and trusts. And maybe that makes ads a little more palatable and a tiny bit less of an immediate skip. For example, Segura's platforming of Andrew Tate was supported by Peacock, Satva, Brooklinen, Whoop, and HelloFresh, among others. I think that there are a couple of root-level drivers of all this mess. For one thing, young people in the US have an accurate picture of their financial future, and that future is bleak. They are barely able to tread water. They will probably never own a home, and they have correctly realized that having children for them would be a massive financial burden. In addition to a massive health risk, they cannot bear that burden because they're barely treading water. Most of these conditions are the result of unrestrained late capitalism, very much a darling idea of the right. And you can tell how massively unrestrained capitalism is at the moment by the record profits of the oil and gas companies, even as the temperature ticks up and sea levels rise. But it's a pretty long and complicated conversation to explain how something like Citizens United has led to something like misinformation online, and how that results in ideas that might sound good but don't really work that way. No part of that conversation seems, at first blush, to directly address that loss of hope. And while the right doesn't offer any solutions to that loss of hope, they do offer a community of the angry. And you can understand how, for some folks, that anger is better than nothing. Ultimately, authoritarianism doesn't work. It might be trending for now, but it can't last because it offers nothing. Telling someone there's a crisis at the border is simply not as good as offering them healthcare. I know it seems like so many people are angry enough to accept the former over working for the latter, and in large part right now they are. But in my view, it is inescapable that yelling about trans people, for example, is not going to last because no serious person is legitimately bothered by trans people. I think that the comedy people are producing right now that travels so well on socials because it attacks trans people or women or uses words like gay as a pejorative will look very dated a few years down the road. I think those comedians will come to regret letting those ideas leach into their work. You can get ahead of the game by never letting hopelessness into your art in the first place.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, like and subscribe, and maybe jump on the Patreon if you want to help me make more. And if you want to talk about comedy writing with people who are trying to do it in a constructive way, we also have a Discord channel.